Picture the autumn skies over the English Channel in September 1941. British pilots, hardened by the Battle of Britain, thought they knew every German trick. Then came a new shape cutting across the clouds, a radial-engined predator with wide wings and a brutal silhouette. The first encounters were not duels, they were executions. Spitfires that once danced with Messerschmitts now disintegrated under concentrated cannon fire before their pilots even had a chance to maneuver. The shock spread quickly through fighter command. It wasn't just another German machine, it was a complete rewriting of the air war. Veterans returned silent, unable to describe what had just torn through their formations. One squadron commander wrote in a classified memo that doctrine itself has collapsed. His words never saw daylight until decades later. RAF intelligence scrambled to identify the intruder. When reports confirmed a new Focke-Wulf design, analysts downplayed the danger, fearing widespread panic among the squadrons. But the pilots already knew. They had felt the imbalance in their bones. It wasn't courage that kept them flying, it was discipline, fighting against dread. And before we continue, make sure you like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten truths the official histories never wanted you to hear. Behind the closed doors of the Air Ministry, frantic debates raged. Could the Spitfire, Britain's proud symbol, be rendered obsolete in a single season? Secretly, the answer was yes. And as whispers spread across bases, a new reality took hold. The FW-190 wasn't just faster. It was unbeatable on Allied terms. That realization was the beginning of a psychological crisis that would haunt the RAF for years. It began with hesitation. Pilots briefed for daylight patrols suddenly asked about alternatives, stalling with excuses that sounded routine but carried undertones of dread. Flight surgeons began documenting unusual stress patterns among men who had once been celebrated for their resilience. When intelligence updates warned that FW-190 units were active in a sector, mission aborts skyrocketed. Squadrons that normally accepted risk without hesitation saw nearly half their operations cancelled before contact was even made. Medical records tell the real story. Symptoms ranged from uncontrollable shaking to sudden disorientation, with some aviators reporting phantom sounds of cannon fire even when still on the ground. Psychiatrists described an alarming surge in what they classified as air combat fatigue, a condition distinct from ordinary battle stress. The common factor wasn't enemy numbers. It was the mere presence of a silhouette every pilot recognized as fatal. Reports show that pilots returning from engagements with FW-190 formations often struggled to speak coherently. One debriefing officer noted, "They look at me with eyes fixed wide, repeating only that we were outflown, outgunned, and without hope." These testimonies were quickly marked confidential and filed away. Squadron leaders knew morale was eroding in ways that discipline alone couldn't patch. Unlike the Bf-109, which had become familiar and even predictable, this aircraft felt alien, as though German engineers had deliberately designed a machine to break Allied confidence. The psychological war was being won before engines even ignited. By late 1942, RAF medical branches reported psychiatric casualty rates that dwarfed anything seen in earlier campaigns. The FW-190 wasn't just inflicting losses in the sky, it was tearing holes in the mental armor of Britain's best-trained fighter pilots. In the summer of 1942, fate delivered the Allies something they never expected. An intact FW-190 forced to land on a British airfield after its pilot became disoriented over the channel. Engineers and test pilots swarmed the machine within hours, guarding it like crown jewels. For the first time, Allied intelligence could measure the aircraft against their own machines, not just in rumor, but in hard data. The results were devastating. In climb tests, the FW-190 reached altitudes faster than the Spitfire MKV, the pride of the RAF. In acceleration trials, it leapt forward with a responsiveness that left even seasoned test pilots shaken. The roll rate proved nearly double that of any frontline Allied fighter. Pilots accustomed to graceful Spitfires or sturdy Hurricanes suddenly realized they were facing something built to outmaneuver them in nearly every dimension. One British pilot, after completing evaluation flights, admitted privately, "We are 10 years behind." His words never made it to the press. They were buried in restricted memos, stamped most secret. To reveal the truth publicly would have collapsed confidence across the entire air defense network. Weapons testing revealed even greater disparities. The FW-190 carried a mix of 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns that could shred through bombers with a single burst. Against nimble fighters, its devastating firepower meant that even a brief firing window was enough to end a duel. Engineers scribbled panicked notes about the inability of Allied armor to withstand concentrated hits. Yet perhaps the most chilling discovery wasn't speed or firepower, but the silence. No rattle, no vibration, just a deadly smoothness. Test pilots remarked that the machine seemed to predict control inputs, responding almost telepathically. For the RAF, the realization was stark. They weren't simply outflown, they were outclassed. The arrival of the FW-190 did not just alter air battles, it shredded the very doctrines on which Allied air strategy had been built. For years, British command had relied on a delicate balance: the Spitfire for interception, the Hurricane for defense, and massed bomber formations for offense. That framework assumed parity with the enemy's aircraft. But once reports circulated of entire squadrons being torn apart in minutes, confidence in the system disintegrated. Bomber Command faced the gravest crisis. Missions into occupied Europe had always been risky, but now formations returned mauled beyond recognition. Declassified figures reveal that in some raids, more than a quarter of aircraft never made it home. Losses so catastrophic, they threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign altogether. Air marshals debated abandoning offensive operations until a technical answer could be found, but political leaders feared the propaganda consequences. To admit that German fighters were dominant would hand Berlin a psychological victory as devastating as the aerial defeats themselves. Training manuals became obsolete overnight. Maneuvers drilled into young pilots, climbing turns, defensive spirals, energy-saving dives, proved useless against a machine that could outroll, outclimb, and outgun its opponents. Instructors scrambled to rewrite tactics, but each adjustment lagged months behind battlefield reality. For cadets, the war was no longer about mastering skill. It was about surviving long enough for new aircraft to arrive. Behind closed doors, intelligence committees warned of a looming collapse in aerial supremacy. Some advocated for rushing experimental designs into production, regardless of reliability. Others urged massive investment in engine development, hoping sheer horsepower could close the gap. But no consensus emerged. Instead, a quiet desperation settled over Allied headquarters. It was becoming clear that the war in the skies would not be won by numbers alone. Unless a miracle aircraft appeared, the FW-190 threatened to dictate the future of European air combat. When the FW-190's superiority became undeniable, Allied factories faced an uncomfortable truth. Their most celebrated fighters were already outdated. Yet instead of admitting defeat, industry chiefs initially clung to production quotas. Spitfire MKVs continued to roll off assembly lines, even as test pilots quietly labeled them obsolete. The industrial machine, designed for momentum, resisted abrupt change. Reverse engineering the captured German fighter became an obsession. Engineers at Farnborough stripped the aircraft to its frame, studying the radial BMW 801 engine with disbelief. It produced raw horsepower without sacrificing reliability, a combination that British design bureaus had struggled to achieve. Attempts to replicate its cooling system or fuel injection yielded only partial results. One frustrated engineer wrote, "We are building yesterday's machines, while the enemy flies tomorrow's." American observers shared the alarm. Reports sent to Washington highlighted not only the technical gap, but the cultural one. German engineers had embraced modularity, wings designed for rapid replacement, fuselages optimized for field repairs. In contrast, Allied fighters required extensive maintenance, grounding squadrons at the very moment when flexibility was most critical. Factories scrambled to adapt. New prototypes were rushed forward, including the Spitfire Mk-9 and the American P-47 Thunderbolt. But every day lost meant more crews perished in skies ruled by the FW-190. Production bottlenecks, shortages of high-octane fuel, delays in turbine metallurgy only compounded the crisis. Meanwhile, German industry, despite bombing raids, managed to keep the FW-190 rolling off lines in staggering numbers. The real sting lay in secrecy. Declassified documents reveal that Allied officials downplayed the crisis publicly, insisting that their fighters remained competitive. In truth, engineers knew they were locked in a race against time, one that industrial inertia had already placed them dangerously behind in. For the public, the story of the air war was one of resilience and triumph. Newspapers spoke of Allied fighters holding their own, of Spitfires matching German skill, of bombers pushing deeper into Europe. But behind the press releases, the figures told a very different story. Air Ministry reports routinely massaged the numbers. Losses attributed to mechanical failure often concealed encounters with FW-190 squadrons. Victories claimed by Allied pilots were double-checked against German records and quietly reduced before internal files were sealed. In some cases, claimed kills outnumbered actual FW-190 losses by 3-1. Yet these inflated tallies were released to maintain public faith in the air campaign. The deception extended to the squadrons themselves. Pilots were often told that engagements had been evenly matched, even when gun camera footage revealed total dominance by the German side. Debriefings were edited, and transcripts carefully sanitized before circulating up the chain of command. For the young men flying into combat, the illusion was meant to preserve morale. In reality, it left them fatally unprepared for the reality they would face again the next morning. Historians digging through restricted archives decades later found entire batches of documents stamped, "Not for release." Among them were statistical charts showing survival odds dropping sharply whenever FW-190 units were identified in the area. In certain operations, the appearance of a single German squadron could increase Allied casualty rates by nearly 40%. Such revelations, had they been public at the time, would have sparked outrage, and perhaps even demanded a pause in the air offensive. But the official story was carefully maintained. The FW-190's dominance was buried under patriotic headlines and selective truth. To admit its real impact would have been to acknowledge that for a crucial period, Allied air power was not merely challenged, it was broken. Before the FW-190 entered combat, Allied doctrine rested on a single, unshakable belief. Bombers, flying in tight defensive boxes, could protect one another with overlapping firepower. It was the foundation of the daylight offensive. Generals spoke confidently of formations that could carve through German skies without heavy escort. The arrival of the FW-190 demolished that illusion in brutal fashion. Gun camera reels later declassified show the horrifying mismatch. FW-190 pilots attacked from above and behind, rolling into firing dives that made turret angles nearly useless. With cannons ripping through aluminum, B-17s and Lancasters that had been advertised as flying fortresses disintegrated in seconds. A single pass could cripple an entire section, leaving stragglers easy prey for follow-up strikes. Crew testimonies described the chaos. Waist gunners would shout about an incoming attacker, only to be silenced by a burst that shredded their compartment. Pilots fought to maintain level flight as fuel tanks ignited, often before reaching the target. Survivors spoke of looking across the formation and seeing entire bombers erupt, breaking apart in mid-air while parachutes blossomed too late. The statistics were staggering. Missions deep into occupied Europe sometimes recorded loss rates exceeding 25%. That meant 1 in 4 aircraft and their 10-man crews never came back. For commanders, the math was unsustainable. No air force could endure such hemorrhaging and hope to win. Still, official communiques framed the raids as strategic successes. The truth, however, was stark. Without long-range escorts, bombers were flying into slaughter. The FW-190 had exposed the fatal weakness in Allied doctrine, that firepower and courage could not substitute for air superiority. Behind closed doors, a realization took root. Unless a solution appeared quickly, the bombing campaign, and perhaps the entire Allied war effort, risked collapse. Once the scale of the crisis could no longer be hidden, Allied industry was thrown into a frantic scramble. The message from commanders was blunt. Without new aircraft, the skies over Europe would belong to Germany. What followed was less an orderly development cycle than a desperate arms race, with prototypes pushed into combat before their blueprints were even finalized. The Spitfire Min-9 emerged first, essentially a stopgap born from urgency. Engineers grafted a more powerful Merlin 61 engine into the familiar Spitfire frame, hoping raw speed might narrow the gap. It was an improvement, but test pilots admitted quietly that it still lacked the roll authority and climbing dominance of the FW-190. The edge remained with the Luftwaffe. Across the Atlantic, American designers worked on brute force. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt became the heaviest fighter of the war, built around a massive radial engine and armed with 850 caliber guns. Its durability impressed crews, who sometimes limped home with half a wing missing. Yet its range was limited, leaving bombers exposed deep over Germany. The turning point came with the North American P-51 Mustang, a design initially dismissed before receiving the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the Allies had an aircraft with speed, range, and high-altitude performance. In dogfights, it could finally contest the FW-190 on even terms, and its ability to escort bombers all the way to Berlin shifted the balance of the air war. But even as these machines arrived, they bore the stamp of desperation. Production was rushed, maintenance plagued by shortages, and crews often trained on unproven systems. The war had become a technological sprint, with factories working around the clock to keep pace with German innovation. For every new Allied design, time itself remained the enemy. The FW-190 had forced the Allies into a race for survival, one they could not afford to lose. For nearly 2 years, the FW-190 dictated the tempo of European air combat, but dominance bred complacency. German high command, intoxicated by early success, believed their fighter advantage would last indefinitely. Instead of mass-producing the proven design, resources were siphoned into experimental projects, jet prototypes, oversized bombers, and paper concepts that drained factories already strained by Allied bombing campaigns. By 1943, the numbers began to tell. The Luftwaffe was still fielding superb machines, but production slowed as raw materials dwindled. Aluminum shortages forced design compromises, fuel scarcity cut into pilot training hours. Elite veterans were replaced with green recruits, men who had only a fraction of the flight time once considered essential. The FW-190 itself had not suddenly weakened, but the men flying it were no longer the same caliber of predator. Meanwhile, Allied industry surged. American factories, protected from bombing, produced fighters and bombers in staggering quantities. Britain, despite devastating raids, maintained a steady flow of upgraded Spitfires. Most importantly, the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustangs meant that FW-190s now faced opposition deep inside their own territory. The hunter had become the hunted. German strategy compounded the decline. Orders to disperse forces across multiple fronts, from Russia to Italy to the defense of the Reich, spread resources too thin. FW-190 units that once overwhelmed opponents with concentrated strength were now isolated, outnumbered, and forced into defensive roles. Historians argue that the FW-190 remained a formidable aircraft until the war's end. Its downfall was not technical inferiority, but the collapse of the industrial and human infrastructure sustaining it. Overconfidence had blinded German leadership to a reality the Allies had embraced. Victory in the air was not secured by brilliance alone, but by endurance. By the time German command recognized this, the tide had turned. The FW-190, once the terror of Allied skies, was now struggling to survive in a war it had once dominated. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the FW-190 was no longer the untouchable predator it had once been. Allied factories had caught up, German supply chains had crumbled, and the tide of war had swept decisively westward. Yet the aircraft's shadow did not vanish with surrender. It lingered in memory, in design, and in the hidden files of every nation that had faced it. Allied engineers, now free to examine captured machines without secrecy, found themselves astonished once again. The FW-190's modular construction, its rugged radial engine, its balance of speed and firepower, these features influenced post-war fighters across the globe. From British prototypes to early Cold War jets, echoes of its engineering could be traced. Even the United States Navy drew lessons from its field maintenance efficiency, a feature their own aircraft had sorely lacked. For pilots who had faced it, the legacy was more personal. Many never forgot the terror of seeing its silhouette slash across the sky, or the helplessness of trying to maneuver against its roll. Veterans later spoke not with bitterness, but with respect, acknowledging that for a time, the FW-190 had stripped away illusions and forced them to reckon with the brutal reality of technological war. Historians today still debate its true impact. Some argue it was simply a chapter in a broader story of industrial momentum. Others insist it was the most dangerous piston-engine fighter of the war, a machine that nearly derailed the Allied air offensive before it could gather strength. Both views share one conclusion. The FW-190 was never just another aircraft. It was a psychological weapon, an industrial benchmark, and a reminder that war in the skies is fought as much in the mind as in the machine. Its wings are long gone, its engines silent. But the lessons it burned into history remain, a caution that even the most confident powers can be humbled by a design that changes the rules overnight.